Hello to our KAP pastors. This is Charles Wolford, and we're having some conversations with some of our KAP pastors, and we're blessed to have Pastor Ikki Soma, who is a senior pastor of the City of Refuge in Houston, Texas. Welcome, Pastor Ikki. Good to see you, brother.
Good to see you. Good to see you, Pastor Wolford.
So good to have you. Thank you for joining us. And we've been having some chats and conversations with pastors around the country, but specifically around hot topics as it would be. And today, we know that our world has been turned upside down with the killing of George Floyd, with the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the killing of Breonna Taylor. It's just heightened the tension of racism in our country and our community. You have been front and center as it relates to being a lead pastor around pastoring multi-ethnic congregations and having a voice around the importance of racial equality. So let's talk through this, Pastor. What are you seeing in the city of Houston specifically, but then globally around this issue of the racial tensions that we are seeing in the world?
Yeah, so being an Asian American pastor, I often feel, I'm not black, I'm not white, but with COVID-19, the discrimination and attacks against Asians has heightened. And so for me, this has been a very strange season with COVID-19 and with George Floyd. George Floyd grew up in the neighborhood right where our church is as well. We just had a vigil for him with our sister church on Wednesday, and I was asked to do the opening prayer there.
Oh, wow.
So, it's been kind of really rocking our world. As you know, my wife is African American. We have two biracial children. And so our youngest daughter, even this past Sunday, was rocked because, for the last 2 or 3 months, she's been seeing and sensing attacks against Asians because of the whole, COVID-19 is from China, and Asian people are discriminated against and attacked because of it. We've seen plenty of news reports on it. And then now with George Floyd's killing, she's feeling even, like we talk about trauma from that. Maybe not be the direct trauma, but she's feeling trauma from that. So for us personally as a family, we've been feeling it. And as a church, I think we're primed and poised to talk about these issues because it's not just one audience. It's a group of people who are willing to listen and to really listen and to build relationships across racial and ethnic lines, which has been powerful. And then around the world with COVID-19, like we just mentioned earlier, I think the level of anxiety in our world is heightened, which I think is a great opportunity for us as believers to tell people about Jesus Christ, the burden bearer, heavy load sharer, the one that can take their concerns and anxieties. So, that's what I'm just seeing right now, just a heightened level of anxiety worldwide with all that's happening with COVID-19 and the racial tension.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Our friend and brother, Dr. Eric Mason, who's down in Philadelphia, wrote a manual, as it would be the woke church, around the importance of having some systems and programs in place that helps the congregation really open up these dialogues and conversations around being engaged in racial tension, being engaged in serving different multi-ethnic communities. Pastor Ikki, so what are you doing in your own congregation to ignite these conversations, to have those open dialogues, pastoring a multi-ethnic congregation? What are some of the tools that you have used, and how effective have they been?
Yeah, so we did a sermon series called Ethnic Experience, and this is not recently, but several years ago, Ethnic Experience. We had African-American pastor, white preacher, Hispanic, and myself, Asian. And during that same time, we had a small group curriculum that we went through. And so this is a difficulty and challenge. And I always use this analogy. I'm an illustration guy, as you know. When you go shopping for a new bed or a new recliner, you're looking for something that's going to be comfortable. So we naturally defer and move towards comfort. And talking about race, socioeconomics is not comfortable. And so what we did was we prepared our congregation saying, hey, we're about to, on Sunday mornings, talk about some things that may make you squirm a little bit in your seat because they're uncomfortable things to talk about. And then when you get in small groups, which are largely mixed ethnically and socioeconomically, you're going to continue to talk about these things. And people may share some experiences that may make you uncomfortable and you may even disagree with. So I think to prepare the congregation that way, and I think Christ has done it as the chief reconciler, but I think the reconciliation is going to happen as people build relationships across racial and ethnic lines, and that includes both pastors and Christian leaders as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Martin Luther King quoted Augustine in the phrase that he said, charity cannot be a substitute for justice withheld. And in the context of what we're seeing with George Floyd, in the context of what we're seeing around community, a lot of people are coming out of the closet, as it would be, with wanting to step up, be a part of rallies. I had some conversations with some of my mentors and elders, and one of the questions that I was asking, Ikki, those who lived through the 60s, 1965 through 68, who saw some of the race riots, who saw some of the uprisings. And one of my questions, Pastor Ikki, was, does this feel different to you? And what were the ground swells right after the 68? And then did it seem like things got better and then worse? Or is this similar? What they're saying to me is, Charles, this seems very similar, but here it's 50 years later and we're confronting some of the same things. So talk to us as a pastor in a community. Some people get ignited around these movements. It's hot right now. It's a hot topic. And then they go back to normal 6 months to 9 months when there are no marches, when everybody goes back to, how do we keep this thing ignited with the conversations, Pastor Ikki? I know that's a lot in that statement.
Yeah. I was having this exact same conversation. Kind of on our early conversation about pastors and burnout and all that, mental health is accountability. So I've got two accountability partners, Stuart Perriman and David Hill, who are both Kingdom Agenda pastors as well. And Dave and I were just talking about this at the vigil we had for George Floyd. And I think the 60s, it was pastors and preachers who led the way. Dr. Martin Luther King, churches led the way. But now in our post-Christian America, where so many young people are unchurched, they're not looking to Dr. Tony Evans. They're not looking to Dr. Eric Mason for leadership. You know who they're looking to? They're looking to rappers and social media activists who are tweeting and posting saying, hey, we're having this rally. And so because of that, they don't have that spiritual biblical foundation that was there, again, 50 years ago. So I think that's the big difference between what happened back 50 years ago versus what happened today. Is 50 years ago, it was led by men of the cloth, by pastors and Christian leaders, and the church was at the forefront. But today, we don't see that again. It's rappers and celebrities and social media activists who are kind of leading the way in this movement. And so because of that, I think you're seeing a little bit more, I would say, emotionalism, where it's more of a reaction to what they see and not something that they're in for the long haul. So I think this is going to give the church a great opportunity because, like, Dr. Evans regularly says, there's a church in every community. And so if you want to see change in the community, what better place than rather than random scattered individuals to have a local church who is there, working along the way.
So what would you see then as a pastor leading a multi-ethnic congregation? Are your members coming, Pastor? Should we protest? Should we be out front? Guidance in those spaces. As it relates to charity, people feel much more benevolent now than ever before. What are you encouraging your congregants to do during these times to get engaged, to lean in a little bit more, to have these conversations?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not one for violent protests and the taking of life because life has been taken, but I'm a little bit baffled by evangelical Christians who oppose peaceful protest when in our own name, we're Protestants, we're evangelical Protestants, and the Protestant faith started because of a protest.
That's right.
That generally tilted in favor of the rich and was really against the poor in terms of what Martin Luther saw. And so I don't think there's anything unbiblical about peacefully protesting to take a stand for what's right biblically. But again, when it crosses a line, it becomes violent, it becomes criminal. I think that's where things cross the line. So I would advocate for pastors to say, to your congregation, if that's what you're led to do, you don't have to become an activist. We were just on a call recently, my wife and I, You don't have to be an activist. Not every Christian is called to be an activist, but I think every Christian is called to be active
Sure.
in spreading the truth of the Word of God. So, and taking a stand for the truth of the Word of God. So, I would offer that to a member who came to me.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think that, my wonderful wife, Diane, we were having this very same conversation about the difference between being an activist and activating your faith. Similar, because we were downtown Dallas almost 4 years ago in July of 7th, when there's the Black Lives Matters movement, when Micah, the a member of community, shot the police officers. And my wife was sharing, I think I'm an activist. And I said, well, let's talk through that. What does that really look like? Prior to this incident, were you out on the streets? Were you activating? Were you engaged in the movement? And then I said, well, let's talk through how do we activate our faith and begin to engage. And so thank you for that clarification of those two dynamics, because we have to be pressed in and lean into where I think what makes sense to us and how we are designed by God's purpose for us to get engaged in that. In our text, we see in let justice roll down like a mighty stream, Amos 5. So what would you be saying to our community right now, particularly as it relates to a cry for justice in our communities? Are there any talking points that you're sharing with your community members, your congregation, as it relates to justice specifically, as you are a voice in your community?
Yeah, so actually, funny, the same question was asked to me by my daughter. So my daughter is going to be working at a Christian college here in Texas, and she just asked, what can I do in terms of, bringing awareness of those things. So I just said, here's 3 things you can do. The first thing is pray. And I think going back to my original point about the activism 50 years ago to today is just the church was at the forefront in prayer. I mean, people were in churches praying that God would move. So I'd say the first thing is to pray for our leaders, local and state and federal leaders. And then secondly is God has given us letter writing abilities and emails and even social media to be able to contact our elected officials to ask them, petition them to make some changes when it comes to policing or other things that they may see. So I said, hey, be active in writing letters, but also not just letters of condemnation like, hey, you're an idiot, you're bad, we don't like you. But honestly say, hey, we're praying for you, and we are Christians, or I'm a Christian, I'm praying for you. And what I've seen in Minneapolis or wherever it may be, biblically is wrong, and lay out your argument and ask them to make a change. And the last one is, I just said, I think one of the questions that you had sent me was, it seems like a lot of African-American pastors are speaking up about this, but very few white pastors are. I think for some brothers, I mean, they just don't know what to say. Again, it's uncomfortable. So I've suggested to my daughter, I think small groups or book clubs would be good. So if you would get a book that addresses racial injustice, and then get a group of both black and white and Hispanic and Asian Christians and get together and read the book and discuss it, is a way to begin changing the minds of some people in the group and exposing them to things perhaps they've never heard about or read about. So I think those are 3 things that every believer can do, again, within legitimate biblical means of influencing our culture.
Yeah. So, one of the questions, Pastor Ikki, was why haven't we seen more of your white evangelical pastors step up and have a voice to community? And if Charles is in the room, in the space, the concerns that pastors are having to front, why is the church to some degree seeming a little bit silent during this time, when at other incidents they will step up, but here it seems like there's been some silence. What would you say to that? Why do you think a lot of white evangelical pastors have been quiet on this issue?
Yeah, great question again. So like I mentioned earlier, I just finished writing a book on the difference between black preaching and white preaching and how we can bring those two together, and differences between black preachers and white preachers. Again, a lot of generalities there. No pastor or no church is monolithic at all. But generally, I think if you look at the 2008 elections, if you remember back 12 years ago when President Obama was running, CNN, all the news outlets are running segments of Jeremiah Wright sermons. And if you remember, Jeremiah Wright was President Obama's pastor, and he had a sermon called "The Chickens Have Come Home to Roost." And he addressed America and what happened at 9/11 and afterwards. But then at the same time, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing these same journalists were scouring the podcast files for Dan Urie. So Dan Urie was Vice President McCain's, President Buchanan McCain's pastor in Arizona. And they couldn't find anything. They couldn't find anything that would incriminate or harm McCain's campaign. And the reason why, I believe, is because very often in the white church, the role of the pastor is the priest. He's there to comfort the people. While in the role of the African-American church, very often the pastor plays a role of a prophet, saying, hey, we see what happens on TV with the killing of George Floyd. What does God have to say about this? Right? And so his job is to afflict the comfortable. While on the white church side, his job is not to afflict the comfortable. His job as the priest is to comfort the afflicted. Yeah. So I think that's why very often you don't see white pastors, large, medium, small churches, social media, publicly sermons address what they see in the media, in the news, in our culture, because of the fact I think they see more of their role as, I'm a priest. I'm here to comfort the people. I'm here to give them comforting, reassuring words from God. Well, very often, and not always, but in the African-American community, Hispanic community, the role of the pastor is to be the prophet who says, hey, this is what God has to say about this situation that we're seeing right now on the news.
Thank you. There's a book that's, for me, it's just kind of resurfaced and kind of pulled back off of the shelf. It's Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, Tears That I Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. And there's some prescriptive things, but there's some challenging opportunities just to talk about as prophet and priest or prophet and priest. What are context of sermons that pastors can during these times really share with congregation? I've launched into somewhat of a reset conversation with my congregation, talking through. There's an alarm, in my view, that has been set for the consciousness of America, and that alarm is sounding, and it's time to kind of get back to some of the basics of biblical principles of what God has said, what Jesus has said through justice. Are you any thoughts, as you have a book come out? I want to you maybe give you an opportunity to share a little bit about that, the difference between white and the black pastors. What are sermon contexts for pastors that they can use as an expression during these times to address some racial inequalities?
Yeah, again, I'm not going to just toot Dr. Evans' Urban Alternative, but I think he's been a great resource. I've had a lot of white pastor friends who've reached out to me, both text messages, but also social media, who are using Dr. Evans' material on what's going on in our world today, and they love it because, again, it's obviously biblical, but it's coming from a perspective of an African-American leader who's been faithful for quite a long time. So I'd say that is one. And then
so
also,
you're saying one is embraced would be, is your
reference? One is embraced. Yeah, okay. And he's got another sermon series as well that go with that.
Okay.
I also think too, again, going back to relationships. I don't know the percentages. But I think there's a lot of pastors on both black and white who don't have relationships with other pastors across racial lines. And I think of Warren Wiersbe and E.K. Bailey wrote the book Preaching in Black and White, and they formed this friendship. And that's a great book to read. I use as one of my resources because, again, here are two veteran pastors, veteran preachers who are having aha moments left and right because they're getting to know one another. Suggestion might even be, hey, to do a pulpit swap or some kind of pulpit exchange, or even a seminar, much like we've done here, where we sit down and a white pastor is able to ask an African-American pastor who's visiting, questions that maybe they're afraid to ask or maybe hesitant to ask.
So let's just show, as we have conversations and as a pastor, you mentioned a narrative that many pastors are not addressing, the issue and the attack on our Asian brothers and sisters. What can we do, even as African American pastors, as white pastors, to help our Asian communities, our Asian Americans, because it's oftentimes black and white. It's very rarely do we have these conversations about there's other challenges and other racial issues that we are confronting. What can we personally do as pastors and congregation and leaders to help even our Asian brothers and sisters during this time?
Yeah. So I keep harping on this, but I think relationships, I've met several pastors who I think I'm their first Asian friend. They're like, man, you're like my first Asian friend. I'm like, hey, this is 2020, but just to be fair, I mean, yeah, for some people, having friendships across racial lines is something that's not normal for them or difficult. So I'd say that, to have those relationships. And then, I've seen plenty of signs on social media and have had friends, Asian friends, who've gone to some of these protests and rallies, and they had signs that basically say, the yellow community believes that Black Lives Matter as well. And in many of our inner city communities, there is a tension between Asians and African Americans in some of our urban communities. So to acknowledge some of those things. But again, I think relationships. So when we're seeing, I think in Canada, there's an Asian American man who was basically thrown out of a store, an older Asian man, by a white patron, for African American leaders to say, that's wrong. That's wrong for someone to be attacked physically and discriminated against simply because of the fact of the color of his skin. And obviously Black pastors can say that because they have experienced it themselves. Yeah. So I would say to weep with those who weep.
Yeah. Romans 12 and 15. That's so important.
Yeah.
So Pastor Ikki, thank you so much for your work and your service to the community, to the body of Christ. Hopefully that you and the family continue to enjoy your vacation and your time off, your respite. So God bless you for being able to do that and take time away. To our pastors, our key KAP pastors, thank you all for tuning in and joining us during these chats that we're having. We are hopeful that these tools will enrich your life and your ministry as you continue to serve God's people. God bless you real good, Pastor Ikki. And we pray God's blessings upon you and your ministry and all that you're doing. Keep the faith, brother. We appreciate you.
Yeah, Pastor Wolf, thank you. And Lord willing, I'll see you in April.
All right. Looking forward to it.
All right. God bless.